When Richard Burton passed away, people did not only speak of a stage and film legend, but also whispered about a question that had followed him throughout his entire life. Who did he truly love the most? Amid turbulent marriages, stormy relationships, and the glamour of Hollywood, there was one name that seemed to appear in silence, like an indelible mark on his heart. And towards the final years of his life, when everything had settled, Burton was eventually said to have admitted a truth that fascinated the world. His greatest love was far more complex than people had once believed. Sybil Williams, the devoted wife and the stability of his early struggles. Before Richard Burton became one of the most sought-after figures of stage and cinema worldwide, he was a young, unknown man trying to find his place in the British theatre scene. During that period, Sybil Williams entered his life as an important presence, not with glamour or fame, but with a rare sense of stability amid an uncertain existence. They met in the late 1940s, when both were still struggling to build their acting careers. There were no red carpets, no media attention, only small performances, modest earnings, and a shared belief in art. It was within this context that their relationship formed naturally, based on empathy rather than glamour. Sybil Williams was regarded as a crucial emotional anchor for Burton in his early years. While he was still an unknown actor, she was the one who believed he could go much further than his circumstances at the time suggested. That belief was not only encouraging, but also gave Burton the stability he needed to pursue acting seriously. Their marriage quickly became a true home during the most difficult period of their lives. They had 2 daughters together, and for a time, family life brought Burton a rare sense of peace, something he would later struggle to find again in the same complete way. However, just as Burton's career began to take a breakthrough, that balance gradually started to break down. When Hollywood opened its doors and fame began to arrive, his life changed faster than anyone could have predicted. Long periods away, intense filming schedules, and the pressure of success slowly created distance between him and his family. Sybil, once Burton's strongest support, began to face a harsh reality. The man she once knew was gradually becoming someone else under the weight of fame. Not because of a lack of affection, but because they were being pulled into 2 increasingly separate worlds, one of home and family, the other of an endless spotlight. The breakdown did not happen in a single moment, but through a long process of accumulation, absences, shorter conversations, and gaps that could no longer be filled. As Burton became more widely recognized, his marriage came under increasing strain. And then, a major turning point arrived on a film set, where he met a woman who would completely change the trajectory of his life. From that moment on, Sybil Williams was no longer the center of Richard Burton's story, but rather the first chapter of a long journey filled with passion, pain, and relationships inseparable from his name. Sally Hay, a peaceful refuge in the later years. After years drawn into the vortex of fame, scandal, and turbulent relationships, Richard Burton entered the final phase of his life in a very different state. No longer the man constantly pursued by the press or at the center of controversy, he became quieter, less visible, and seemingly tired of life itself. It was in this context that Sally Hay appeared as a clear contrast to everything he had experienced before. Sally did not bring Burton glamour or excitement like his previous relationships. Instead, she offered something he had rarely known: calm. Life with Sally was not surrounded by the press, not clouded by rumors or public pressure, but simply made up of everyday moments where he could briefly set aside the image of Richard Burton the legend and return to being an ordinary man. What made this relationship special was not emotional intensity, but stability. Sally Hay seemed to understand very clearly that the man in front of her carried not only the present, but also a very long past. A past that could not easily be erased, especially with the weight of his famous former relationships. In Sally's way of relating to him, there was no competition with the past, nor any attempt to replace those who had once been important in Burton's life. Instead, she accepted a simple truth: some memories never disappear, and some relationships do not need to be replaced for a person to move forward. This acceptance created a rare space for Burton in his later years. He no longer had to live under the pressure of proving himself or maintaining an image in the public eye. Instead, he could exist more slowly, more reflectively, and with less inner conflict driven by external expectations. However, even within that peace, there remained an unspoken silence. It was the sense that Burton's heart had never fully belonged to the present. Sally could provide warmth, but she could not erase the deep imprints left in his life by earlier relationships. And it was precisely this coexistence of peace and memory that shaped a complex final chapter in Richard Burton's inner world. A man who longed for serenity, yet could never fully detach himself from what had shaped him. An attempt to start over in the shadow of the past. After a series of turbulent marriages and relationships that became Hollywood legend, Richard Burton gradually entered a phase he had long desired, a fresh start. Not a restart of his career, as his name was already firmly established in film history, but a restart of his personal life. Something that seemed simple, yet became nearly impossible for someone carrying so much history. Susie Miller entered Burton's life as a clear attempt to find stability after years of upheaval. This marriage carried the hope of a new chapter, where he might step out from the long shadow of his past, particularly the memories inseparable from Elizabeth Taylor. At the time, many believed this could be an opportunity for Burton to build a calmer life, less exposed to media scrutiny. At first, their relationship carried a quietness that Burton had lacked for much of his life. No public arguments, no press-chased tours. Life with Susie Miller seemed like a lower-volume version of his existence. However, that calm did not mean the past had disappeared. The greatest pressure Susie faced did not come from Richard Burton himself, but from the presence of Elizabeth Taylor, a name that was not only his former wife, but also a global cultural icon, tied to some of the most intense memories of his life. Even though they were no longer together, Elizabeth remained an inseparable part of Burton's inner world, creating an invisible distance between him and his current marriage. In the public eye, everything Burton and Susie did was constantly measured against that past. The press repeatedly referenced Elizabeth Taylor as a benchmark, making it difficult for Susie to escape the feeling that she was living in someone else's shadow. This created not only external pressure, but also a growing emotional strain within their relationship. For Burton, while he respected and cared for Susie, he could not deny that the past remained present like a parallel current. His memories with Elizabeth were not only romantic recollections, but experiences that had shaped how he understood himself, passion, and loss. Over time, the relationship between Richard Burton and Susie Miller gradually became fragile, not due to a lack of initial affection, but because of the imbalance between present and past. One side was the effort to rebuild a life, the other was memories too powerful to be replaced. In the end, this marriage also came to an end, leaving behind a clearer truth than ever. For Richard Burton, the past was not merely something that had happened. It was something that always traveled with him, no matter how many times he tried to start over. Princess Margaret, a special friendship, and the rumours. During the years when Richard Burton became one of the biggest stars of British theatre and cinema, he was known not only for his powerful Shakespearean performances, but also for a social life closely connected with the aristocracy. Among these complex relationships, the name Princess Margaret was often mentioned as one of the most distinctive connections in his life. Unlike his loud romances or turbulent marriages, the relationship between Burton and Princess Margaret carried a far more refined and difficult-to-define character. They were not publicly presented as a couple in the traditional sense, but they were also not simply acquaintances within artistic and royal circles. This ambiguity led public opinion at the time to constantly speculate about the true level of closeness between them. The only certain thing was mutual respect. Richard Burton, with his acting ability and deep knowledge of Shakespeare, earned the admiration of Princess Margaret, a figure known for her sharpness, sophistication, and love of the arts. In return, Burton was drawn to her intelligence, strong personality, and confident manner, which were very different from the usual formal image of the monarchy. Their appearances together at high-profile social events only increased public curiosity. However, behind the rumours, this relationship always seemed to maintain a clear boundary, close enough to create a connection, but distant enough not to cross the limits of status and responsibility that both carried. Unlike the emotionally explosive relationships in Burton's life, with Princess Margaret, he seemed to find a more intellectual space rather than a romantic one. They shared deep conversations, reflections on art, culture, and human nature, subjects that were rarely explored in detail in public narratives about his personal life. For this reason, even though it was never confirmed as an official romance, the relationship between Richard Burton and Princess Margaret remains one of the most distinctive chapters of his life. A chapter that does not require a clear definition, yet is enough to keep the public curious and cultural historians repeatedly returning to it. For Burton, this was perhaps not a romance in the usual sense, but a rare intersection between two people from different worlds, where art, power, and loneliness met in brief but unforgettable moments. Elizabeth Taylor. The greatest love of his life and an inseparable fate. Among all the women who entered the life of Richard Burton, none left a mark as deep and intense as Elizabeth Taylor. This was not just a relationship, but a cultural phenomenon, an emotional storm, and also a chapter of his life that he never truly managed to close. They met on the set of Cleopatra in the early 1960s, at a time when Hollywood was closely following every move of a massive film production. From their very first scenes together, a powerful and almost uncontrollable attraction emerged between them. It was not the gentle romance often seen, but a form of intense connection full of clashes, where emotion and personality constantly erupted. At that time, both Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor were already married, which made their relationship an even bigger focus of global media attention. The press followed them not only as film stars, but as a dramatic real-life story unfolding day by day. After they officially came together, they quickly became the most powerful couple in Hollywood. Their names dominated the press, from red carpets to private life. But alongside this fame came constant turmoil, arguments, jealousy, public pressure, and differences in two very strong personalities. They married not once, but twice, and divorced twice as well. Between those marriages and divorces was a relationship that could not be clearly defined. Part love, part conflict, and part emotional dependence that neither could easily escape. Even after their separation, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor never truly disappeared from each other's lives. They remained in contact, wrote letters, made phone calls, and appeared at important moments for one another. At times they were legally apart, yet still remained connected as if they had never truly separated. This complexity made the relationship completely different from all others in Burton's life. It was not simply love, but a kind of destiny, where attraction and pain existed side by side, inseparable. For Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor was not only a woman he deeply loved, but also someone who changed him forever, in a way no one else ever could. When Richard Burton entered the final years of his life, the fame that had once surrounded his entire career seemed to have faded. There were no more constant tours, no more marriages dissected by the media in detail, and no more life driven by the pace of fame. Instead, there was slowness, longer silences, and deeper reflection on his own life. During this period, as he looked back on all the relationships he had experienced, Burton no longer viewed them as a star or an icon, but as a human being trying to understand his own heart. Each woman who had entered his life left a different mark, but only one name kept returning, regardless of time or distance. And that name was Elizabeth Taylor. According to later accounts and reflections, Burton admitted that no matter how many relationships he had in his life, Elizabeth Taylor remained his greatest love. Not because they were happiest together, but because no one else could evoke within him such a powerful and complex emotional force, both passion, pain, and an unbreakable bond. Elizabeth Taylor was not just a memory, but a part of Richard Burton's very nature. She represented the most brilliant, but also most chaotic period of his life, where love and conflict always coexisted and could never be separated. In the end, what Richard Burton left behind was not only legendary performances or great fame, but a love story without a clear ending, a connection that transcended marriage, divorce, and time. And perhaps, as he himself realized in his later years, There are people who do not need to stay in your life forever, because they already remain in your heart in a way that can never be replaced.